Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Mike here at Games from Scratch, and today we were talking about Blender. Specifically, we were talking about UPBGE, which we can consider Blender Game Engine 2.0. Now here's the thing that kind of was funny. Blender 2.80 was released, and it really made Blender so much better. We had a massive UI overhaul, we got the EEVEE real-time renderer, we got Grease Pencil, some really great 2D animation tools, cycles improvements, all that stuff, and we got the Blender Game Engine removed. So here you can see this is Blender's new renderer. This is EEVEE in action, and it is really nice, good performance, great for games. And it's kind of funny that at the point in time where they got the perfect rendering technology for making games, they also, well, they removed their game engine. So that was a little unfortunate, but the thing is, back in 2015, I believe it was, one of the main developers for the Blender Game Engine forked off UPBGE to take things in their own direction. And with the whole Blender nuking the Blender Game Engine from orbit kind of thing, well, they kind of took the mantle from there. So what they've been doing is merging in changes to Blender and then you know, adding the Blender Game Engine functionality on top of them. So if you've been interested in adding game logic inside of Blender, that's what UPBGE is all about. So first thing we're going to do is look really quickly at the functionality or the features that are enabled by UPBGE. So if you ever want to create a game using Blender, UPBGE is technically a C++ game engine, but all of the features and functionality are in Blender. So it's got a main loop and a renderer that's written in C++, but all your game logic can be done using nodes in Blender or via Python. There's a full and robust Python API. We're not going to cover that today, but what we'll look at is enabling game logic to your nodes. So we've got here right now, so for example, we got this guy scene in the background. I'm going to go to the physics settings for this guy. Always miss it. Here we go. So you see here, this is default setup as static. And some of this functionality is being added by UPBGE. UPBGE extends the properties of Blender itself, but otherwise it feels exactly like you're using normal Blender. So now we've got this mesh I just created in the scene. And we're going to think of this guy, this is our main character. And we're going to add some logic to it. So this guy is also going to be physics-based, but instead of static, I'm going to go ahead and create this guy as a rigid body. Now, physics is nothing new to Blender, but what's key here is we're going to create this guy as an actor. That means it's going to participate with the full simulation. It'll trigger things like sensors and so on. And now we can add some logic to this guy. So we got our scene added. We've got it created as an actor. We could go ahead and set up some physics properties for this guy, but we'll just keep it as the default. Just keep in mind, you can do things like change the mass, the radius, the elasticity, and so on. So now that we've got our main character in the scene, let's go ahead and fork up a new window here. And this is the guts of the logic. So we got logic editor. I'm going to zoom in so you can actually see what I'm talking about. And this is a way we string together game logic. So we've got our guy up here, and what we want to do is have it respond, say, to keyboard presses. So the first thing is we've got our sensors. Sensors can be thought of as like inputs or actions. So we've got things here like on mouse movement or on near something else, or radar, so it senses something coming close, or a trigger, or so on. And you can define all of these things on all of the objects you use in Blender. Blender, a lot of the features and functionalities, most of the things that you would use in Blender are exposed in some way, shape, or form to UPBGE. We can also got things like we could go ahead and pass messages. I'll show you that a little bit later on, because that's one of the ways that you could communicate between objects in the world. But we're going to do this one really simple and have a keyboard handler. And let's say we're going to go ahead, so you see there's, for each one of these things, each sensor we added, we get a special dialog for it. This one we're going to do press A key, and then with that selected, down arrow. So if down arrow is fired, it's going to fire this up. So we can also set in like also shift and also control or whatever, but we're good with that one. We can also log out things. We can have it specifically target something, but nope, we're good. Down arrow is pressed. It's going to fire off this sequence of events. Now we have controllers. These are your logical things for looping things together. You've even got Python and expression options here, but most of the time what you're going to use is something like and. And you see we've got these connectors here, so we're just going to do boom. So when this triggers, it's going to do this. Now we can link this off. We can have multiple links in and out of each particular point, but finally we've got actuators. We can think of actuators like verbs. These are things that do stuff. So you see here we've got a number of different ones. It's scrolling off screen in an annoying way right now. It makes it hard to see, but we got a ton of different options here. So we got things like, we could, again, messages. We could get data sets like collections and such. We can go with steering controls, built-in sound, so you can play a particular sound. So we could have done things like here. We could have a radar that when you get to a certain proximity, it plays a sound. But in this case, what I'm going to do is motion. So now that when we hit the down arrow, this condition happens, and we will go ahead and do this. So here we're just going to go ahead and fire off -1 force. So that'll put us -1 in the y-axis. It should knock us off the building. And that is kind of the extent of how you set up your logic. It's pretty straightforward. And as I mentioned earlier on, you've also got options there's a full Python framework behind the scenes. We'll look at that really briefly when we look at the documentation, but I'm not going to cover that today. So, but if you want, you've got the full ability to extend and create your game logic entirely in Python. You can also extend most of this functionality in Python. You can actually have some integrations with Python. And then we've also got the ability to add components, which are Python. We also have the ability to add game properties. You can think of these like as variables for this particular object. But in this case, we're happy. The final thing we need to do basically is just pin this guy to there. So when this condition happens, we will go ahead and fire off this motion. So there, we added some logic. And as I mentioned earlier on, you can have multiple pieces of logic. So we could go ahead and say here, if we want to do and fire off a message. So what we could do is fire a message off to another object. You come here, you pick the object in your scene. So we're going to tell building 124 that you suck. And the text of our message is you suck. So this is a way of basically communicating between things. And once again, we can also fire this off with the same logic sequence, or we could have had it go off of a different thing, or again, we could have a completely different sensor, so we fire it when it gets within proximity, for example, and so on. So that is kind of how programming works. Now, obviously, I'm going to get rid of this guy here and this guy here because they don't do what I want. But you can see that is how you could string multiple things together in the logic editor and really kind of make your game make sense to the world. You can add properties to it and you can add components. And once again, behind the scenes, you can Python the heck out of things. All right, so now that we've done that, we've set this guy up. It's in the world. Now let's go ahead and run it. So how do we run it? Well, we come up here to the render tab. And you'll notice here in render, we've got a couple of extensions that have been made to Python, to Blender itself. We've got game resolution and game debugging. Game debugging is for things like you could have physics visualizations, remove UI flickering, mouse cursor details, debug properties, and so on. Don't care about any of that, but what I instead care about is this guy. So we've got a couple of options here. We can use the viewport render, which is really nice now with EEVEE as an option, and we can either fire it as a standalone version, so to run on its own window, or we can actually run it directly inside of Blender. So we'll go ahead and do that. So here we're basically saying run our game. And there, boom, physics kicked in. I'll drop this guy down so you can actually see what we're doing. Oh, I can't because I've got focus. I got to hit escape to be able to manipulate Blender. So there, I'll go ahead, hit the arrow key a couple times. You see we get some movement going on. And then physics kicks in. Oh, I ran out of motion. Why are we falling? Oh no. All right, so I'm going to show it the other way. All right, here we go. We're rolling. We're rolling. We're rolling. Why are you not enough motion? All right. So I'm going to jack up my force, and I'm going to minimize the window before I play it this time. Okay, so we're back to full screen. Embedded start. We've got more force being fired at our object. We're loading our scene. Our scene is loaded. Hit the button. And it's enough this time, and down it goes. There you go. So that is how you can go ahead and basically add logic into your scene. You can start adding games. There's all kinds of stuff embedded directly inside to make, you know, the integration between Blender and UPBGE work. But you kind of got a taste for at least what the process is. And it's pretty straightforward and easy to learn. And some people use this even if they weren't making games, just to like add some certain logic into their world. Again, you can also do a standalone start, which will run this into a smaller window. And when you're finished and ready, basically this is available to run on all major desktop platforms and experimentally on Android. Now, if you want to run a Blender application in a web browser, instead you probably want to look at something like Blend for Web or Verge 3D that we just covered, because Blender, it doesn't target that platform. So you see we're running it in a window instead. And I'm running into my force problem once again. And then you can run it in, so let's see, desktop platforms, and there's an Android experimental, no iOS platform yet, unfortunately. All right, so that was UPBGE in action. Let's do a quick rundown of what it's available or what the details are. If you're interested in learning more, UPBGE is available at upbge.org. Kind of gives you a rundown of the functionality that's built in there. Behind the scenes, you've got full audio engine powered by OpenAL and SDL supporting 3D sounds and sound effects. So you can actually set up so your sound simulation takes into effect the 3D world that's around it, which is really kind of cool. Fast workflow, convenience of Blender, internal end cycles, nodes, so you can set up advanced shader nodes that you work. And so basically, your results are going to look like what they look like. So if you're really comfortable working in Blender, you don't really have the exporting stage because you're working directly in your content creation tool. You got full physics. It's powered by the bullet physics simulation. You saw rigid bodies. You can also do soft bodies, obstacles, pathfinding, and more. The logic system, we saw that in action. We got PBR materials, Python language bindings, support for more libraries through the use of PyPy. We've got render attachments, Faker real-time reflections, HDR pipeline, the deployment platforms, as I mentioned earlier on, Windows, Linux, and Mac, an experimental Android version available. You can also deploy via bplayer with encrypted blend files. So your game development is secured. So yeah, that is UPBGE. Obviously, this guy is open source. Now, here's one of the downsides, and this is one of the downsides for Blender, and I'm not going to really get into the details of this, but they're GPL. So Blender is GPL based, and GPL makes all kinds of sense if you're shipping an application. When it comes to a game engine where there's the chances of you modifying it for your own uses and wanting to keep your source closed is a lot higher than, a lot of people don't modify their content creation tool, or if they do, they don't mind sharing the results. But your game engine, but unfortunately, since it's built on Blender, it's inheriting that Blender GPL license. So that is definitely one thing to be aware of. But the full source code is available here on GitHub if you're interested in checking it out. Another question you may be having at this point in time is, what does UPBGE stand for? It stands for Uchronia Project Blender Game Engine. Why? Don't know. Do not have a clue why they picked that name, but that is what U in the UPBGE stands for. So Uchronia Project, by the way. If you're interested, it is also very much actively being developed. So version 3 was just released, we're talking 10 days ago, and we got things like Blender viewport integration, EEVEE, Grease Pencil, Workbench, integration with the new collection stuff via an actuator. Collections were added with 2.8. I believe, and give you a much more advanced control over how your scene is organized and so on. So it's definitely nice major improvements there. And then other improvements across the board. So this is definitely a thing that is being actively updated, and that's obviously very important because there's another option out there, that makes the closest competitor to UPBGE right now is probably the Armory game engine. And one of the things I've most problematic with Armory as of late is they're not doing release notes of their updates. You got no idea really what's going on, and they're kind of reinventing the wheel over there. So if you're looking for a Blender game engine, it used to be Armory was a no-brainer, but with UPBGE improving, the EEVEE real-time renderer making things really great, and questionable things going on at Armory, this is definitely one to check out. Now, another really interesting thing about UPBGE is the level of documentation. So the manual here has, and I know page count really isn't that important, but it's kind of important. And you'll see here, this is 435 pages of documentation. And as I mentioned earlier on, the entire back end of everything here, there's a ton of Python there. So there's a full-blown Python exposed game engine. So if you don't want to use this nodes-based system, if you'd rather work in Python, as you can see by the documentation, it's all Python code and classes on the back end. So you could probably develop a full game using nodes, but if you really want to get into it, or if you really want to customize things, you're probably going to be dropping down into the Python level. And that, as you can see here, is very well documented. So that's definitely another thing to be aware of with UPBGE. And then finally, and this has absolutely nothing to do with UPBGE, but I figured I should shout this out. I was really impressed with this one. I wanted a scene that would kind of show off EEVEE and kind of would be typical of what a game level might look like, so you can get an idea of what performance would look like and what it will be like in the real world. And I found this guy, and it's a neat scene. The only thing that looks crap in it is my my sphere that I added. So you come down here if you wanted to check out a really good scene that is more evocative of an actual game in action. Well, that's what this is, and this guy is being made by Andreas Stromberg. So if you're interested, I will link his page as well. He's released a couple of really high-quality assets on Gumroad completely free, including this level. So if you want a level to play around with, this is a great one. It showcases EEVEE in action, but it's typical of what a game level might look like. So if you want to check out UPBGE and you want some content to go with it, check out Andreas's work as well. This is pretty nice stuff. So anyways, that is UPBGE, the future of Blender game engine. And I'm going to almost leave on that note because another thing that is worth noting is there was a lot of people out there that were disappointed that they took the logic nodes out of Blender, and because they used it for simulations or whatever that on their own, even if they weren't making games. And apparently it's on the to-do list for Blender to add simulations back in. So some of the Blender game engine functionality is going to return at some point in the future to Blender. It'll be interesting to see how that will impact UPBGE, how those things will be merged and so on. But as a game engine to make and publish and you know, expose games out to the world, Blender is never going to be that again. The simulation stuff is going to be more about the logic nodes that we saw that were removed out. So it'll be interesting to see how UPBGE and Blender evolve going forward in that area. All right, so that's it. UPBGE, have you checked out Blender Game Engine in the past? If so, what do you think? Is that license kind of a gotcha for you? My big things before were the license and the real-time renderer sucks. So they killed one of those two. EEVEE made things so much more appealing to me to make something like Blender Game Engine work. So I'm really happy to see UPBGE exists, although I probably won't work with it myself that much, unless you guys are really interested in some content. If you are, let me know. I'll see what I can do. All right, talk to you all later. Goodbye.